All right. Well, good morning for those of you here in the U.S. On the call, and good afternoon for some of the international, or good evening folks that are on the call. I appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. So this is Dr. Dan Kaiser from the University of Minnesota is going to be leading us on a discussion today. As you can see here by the title on the screen, applying micronutrients, are the odds in your favor? So I'm assuming we'll get into a little bit of what conditions are a good idea to go ahead and go towards those micronutrient applications, or when it's really not going to get a bang for your buck on it. But a brief background on Dr. Kaiser. He's done a lot of work at Iowa State, so majored in agronomy as an undergrad, and then master's and PhD work were all on soil fertility. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, and an estate extension specialist in soil and plant nutrition management at Minnesota. So for the guys in this room, he's sort of the equivalent of what Steve Coleman might be doing here, state fertility expert at Ohio State, or Kurt Steinke up at Michigan State, kind of in that title or that position. His current research focus is developing research and extension related to soil testing and fertilizer management to develop fertilizer guidelines for major field crops in Minnesota. So a lot of what I think you'll be speaking about today will be sort of specific to the northern Corn Belt, and I know that's going to be different, but a lot of these principles are going to hold in different areas of the country and in the world. So it's not everything's going to be exact, as we're all working with different soil types and we have different climates, but some of the context here can definitely be translated into other areas. So just a couple of housekeeping things. We've got a handful of people on the call. I appreciate it. Would you guys all please, I'm not gonna dictate microphones, so please regulate yourself. Keep your microphone muted so we don't get any feedback or background noises or kids playing or dogs barking. And then if you have any questions, feel free to just go ahead and unmute yourself and politely interject. And I'm sure while a slide is up, Dr. Kaiser could answer your questions. Also of note, give a little grace because we are dealing with an overloaded internet right now, and so there might be a little bit of lag time on some of these slides. So Dr. Kaiser is professional. I'm sure he will adapt and keep his talking lined up with the slides as best as he can, but things do happen. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Kaiser, and if you want to say a few words and go ahead and take off, I appreciate it. Thanks, Dan.
No, thanks for the introduction. Actually, you did a pretty good job with it. And yeah, like you said, my internet's lagging a little bit. So if there are any questions there might be some pauses, particularly on some of the slides where I have some larger pictures. So as was mentioned, I'm currently in the state of Minnesota. One of the areas that I have been working on is a lot of product testing work and some work involving testing micronutrients, and that's been, I know, a major question we've had for many of our growers here, particularly we have a lot of corn and soybean acres, so that's where a lot of my focus is going to be, although we do have a more diverse cropping system here in Minnesota with other crops. So it's one of the things with the diversity and the diversity of the soils we tend to have some big questions as we go from the south east to the northwest part of the state with some of what our growers are interested in, looking particularly at micronutrients because of some of the diversities in soils that are out there in the state of Minnesota. So what is a micronutrient? A micronutrient is essential for crop growth, but it's taken up in small quantities. I know there's a few people from not in the US, most of this stuff are going to be imperial units. I've tried to kind of convert, and I'll talk a little bit about those, but typically less than 1 pound per acre, kilos per hectare. It's kind of the pretty much equivalent there. So I didn't go through and do any conversion on those. So I'll apologize for that. But some of the nutrients are beneficial. We know there's several micronutrients like chloride, nickel. Some crops will favor, particularly chloride. We know small grains, it's a bigger issue with those in areas of our state where potassium was high. We know that chloride can be an issue, particularly for small grains where we haven't really been applying potash. So there's some of these other nutrients that do come into play. It's one of the things that you'll hear me say here in a moment, that we know that there are a lot of crop specifics when it comes to micros as well. So that's one of the things to watch out for, is that not all crops are going to be sensitive to a deficiency, and others might be sensitive to other nutrients such as chloride that aren't going to be sensitive in some other crop species. For the most part, uptake is metabolically controlled, particularly for many of the anions, if you look at it. Although I will show some data, if we look at a lot of our micros, when we measure nutrient concentrations, we do tend to see increases in nutrient uptake if it's applied, and that's one of the ways we track whether or not the fertilizer that we're applying is the crop is getting some benefit from it, even though there's no increase in yield. So we'll see that some are controlled better than others, particularly boron, which I'll talk about later, is one of them that I do concerns me more, because we know that toxicity can be a problem with that particular nutrient. So again, we'll get into that later here in this presentation. And if we start looking at nutrient deficiencies, most are immobile in the plant. So if you're looking at trying to identify a deficiency within a field, for the most part, you're going to be looking at the upper canopy for many of the micronutrients. So when you start looking, it's pretty easy to tell from those compared to some of our major macronutrients, which the deficiencies are in the lower parts of the plant because they're moved around in the plant better. That micros, you're generally going to be looking at the upper canopy of the plant itself. So again, here's just a rundown of macro and micros. Again, I'll be talking mainly at what I'd call the top 5, which are boron, copper, iron, manganese, and zinc. I'll mention molybdenum. We're doing some work with chloride right now, particularly when it comes to soybean production. I think I've got some mention of that a little bit later, that there's some concerns on my end, particularly from some of our soils that we have that can maintain high salt contents of chloride building in those soils with potash applications. And the other one's nickel. That one does come up. Some of these, are more related to some of the soil microorganisms and giving some benefit to some of the biology that's in the soil versus a direct effect on the crop itself. So again, the main 5, boron, copper, iron, manganese, and zinc, these are the ones I'm going to cover today, with really boron, iron, and zinc being kind of the top 3 when it comes to where we get questions on here in the state of Minnesota. So just to give a little rundown here on corn uptake of micros, what we're talking about is less than a pound or a kilo per acre, less than a kilo per hectare. So if we look at most of them, my screen is not switching here. We look at just a few ounces to the acre. So in terms of overall uptake, it doesn't take a lot. The one that tends to pop up more often than not with higher concentrations is iron. If we look at total uptake, a lot of that though is due to contamination. When we look at soil contamination, when you're running your nutrient analysis on your plant tissue samples, you can clean your samples. And what we found is it's really hard to get iron completely and all the little small clay particles cleaned off of the soil itself. So when it comes to uptake, that one's one that tends to come a little bit higher, but normally we see that overall everything else pretty small, particularly boron, where we're looking at only around about 1/10 of a pound, or just again a few ounces per acre. So I'm going to divide this into what I'd call talking points. I've got 3 of them here. Mainly when I break this this discussion down into. The first one really I think is very important is when you're looking at assessing micronutrients, particularly for crop production, that it's largely crop specific. And if you look at a crop sensitivity, again, they vary from crop to crop. When we start talking about deficiencies, particular micronutrients, and also toxicities, and I'll talk about that because that's another point. Again, with boron, that I do concern me a little bit in terms of what we see going on, and I have seen some instances of boron toxicity, pictures being sent to me from consultants around the state from over application. So in terms of sensitivities, if I look at our particular state, the state of Minnesota, if we look at what crops are sensitive to a deficiency, boron, alfalfa is typically one that's talked about a lot. I've got a lag here. There we go. Clover and sugar beet also come in. We've got a fair number of sugar beet acres, so those are the ones that are going to be more sensitive. Corn, more often than not, is kind of where we see a lot of the interest from growers, particularly from just the standpoint of a lot of tissue analysis going on out there and a lot of perceived low boron tissue concentrations. Copper, small grains, and corn, we don't tend to see a lot of issues with copper other than small grains, particularly in organic soils where we have greater than 10% organic matter. That's an area that tends to pop up. Manganese, this has kind of been a big one moving forward when we start looking at a lot of interest from growers, particularly for glyphosate tolerant crops. So we'll see if this switches to where I want it to go. So manganese has been a big one, and I know kind of where a lot of you are, particularly if you get out towards Ohio, Michigan, and those areas, there are some soils out there that are deficient in manganese, and that's one of the things that some of the pictures I have, a lot of them I'm borrowing from conditions where we're out farther out to the east, where the problems are more prevalent. We know that the glyphosate tolerant crops, particularly with soybean, brought this to the forefront, particularly for some of the work back in the early 2000s in Purdue, where they were seeing some issues with decreased uptake of micronutrients, particularly manganese, following the applications of glyphosate. So that spurred more interest in foliar applications. We were doing more work here in Minnesota, and one of the things that we've seen in particular is that it's really still the soils that were traditionally deficient. So if you're looking at trying to assess things, a soil test probably is the best option in terms of trying to figure things out. And some of these flash symptoms that we see, particularly in soybeans, where they'll go yellow after the glyphosate application, they tend to come and go and the plants green up, and generally many of the fields we have no problem beyond beyond just that initial flash occurring within the soil itself.
Hey, Dan, just real quick, have you noticed or have you
Yeah,
seen, I'm sorry, have you seen any of those similar issues possibly with like Liberty Link technology or glufosinate, or is it glyphosate specific?
it's mainly been with glyphosate. We haven't really looked at it. We haven't had enough experience right now yet with, and we haven't had the stress conditions show up recently to see some of that. Now, back in, I think it was back in 2012 and 13, got a slide here and it won't show up here, that we were looking at soybean response to micros. And we were looking at boron, chloride, manganese, and zinc, and we had several of the fields that showed some of that flash symptomology in it. And if we look at the data across the 12 locations we tested, absolutely no yield response. And the interesting thing that we've seen with, particularly with manganese, is in many of the studies, I struggle to get any increase in the tissue concentration from manganese sulfate applied. And usually we'd consider that to be highly available, that it should go into the plant. The studies that we had when we looked at boron, chloride, and zinc, all three of those, when we applied it, we increased tissue concentration without an increase in yield. So we know that the material was getting into the plants. It just wasn't being effectively utilized. And we've seen it pretty consistently with many of the micros, but other than manganese. And even in situations where we see some of that flash, you have to look, I think, at the underlying principles in the soil itself. If it's deficient, it's likely going to be a problem. If it's not, I mean, just a few days here where the plant's yellow aren't necessarily that big of an issue. So are you seeing, is it a picture of soybean plants up on your screen right now? Because I think I'm behind by one slide here on my screen.
I'm not seeing the soybeans yet. We're getting the response to micros at R2 trifoliate.
Okay, so okay, so there it is. So again, this is kind of some of the data we've been looking at. We had, again, 12 locations, 42.8 bushels average, which wasn't stellar, but we had some low yielding sites. It's around 2,800 or about 2,900 kilos per hectare in terms of the yield level. So it wasn't overall great for what some of our stellar yields are, but if you look at the numbers are just almost exactly the same with and without the micros. So, I mean, it really just hasn't been consistent. And these were broadcast applied before planting, all put down and incorporated before the soybeans were planted. One of the larger issues that I have noticed in some of these plots, again, is boron toxicity. And I've had some really nice, clear pictures of this. We've had a number of locations, in particular, when we look at a few of the sites within the soybean response to micros, that slide, there are a few of those sites actually we're seeing a small yield decreases from boron applications. And these just showing a picture where we put on 5 pounds or 6 kilos per hectare of boron. So it's pretty high rate on beans. I would never suggest that. We've seen it, though, these symptoms show up with as low as 2 pounds. And I've actually seen it show up in dry beans as well with foliar applications of really low rates. So that's one of the things with boron, soybean, dry bean, those that we have in the state. I really do not suggest the application just because of some of the issues that we've seen with it in terms of potential yield reductions. It has never increased yield, and we've seen more consistent decrease in yield from toxicity problems occurring. Corn, I'll show some data with that. It takes a lot higher rate to get a toxicity to show up in corn, and we haven't really seen too many issues with that. Are you seeing a slide that says what crops are sensitive to toxicity right now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, see my preview screen on the right is like one slide behind. So that's one of the things to look at. Boron, edible beans, and soybean. I throw those into a sensitive crops when it comes to toxicity. Just be careful with those, particularly with foliar applications. It's one of the reasons I really suggest keeping rates low. I've been able to put 5 pounds or close to 6 kilos to the hectare on with corn and not had too much of an issue or seen any issue with it. But it is a problem with boron toxicity because there's a fine line between deficiency and toxicity that can easily be pushed into toxicity. So it's one of the things I stress to a lot of our consultants, just be careful with what you're doing with boron. The rest of these I really haven't seen much of a toxicity issue with. And if you look at cereals, for us being kind of they say copper, they kind of the same thing where it's sensitive to a deficiency, but also can overdo it. Just be careful with that. Manganese and zinc, two cereals have been kind of the major issue. Bioavailability, we know that is tied to pH. That's one of the things. Our soils, we have situations where we have pHs ranging anywhere from just slightly below 5 all the way up to 8.5 or 8.4 is kind of the maximum we see. And we see a lot of questions, particularly with micros and zinc, with some of those high pH situations. We know if you look at pH, if you look at availability, look at these wider bars where it shows that our nutrients are more available. So once we get beyond about pH 7, we know the availability of some of these micros will start to drop off. However, if we look at a lot of our soil tests don't always indicate that they're deficient. So that's one of the things that even though pH we know can be an issue, that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a problem. I mean, a soil test really is the best option for many of these micros to get a good assessment of it. I will not be talking too much about copper. We have tried to look at situations in applying copper, particularly for corn. Since I've been here in organic soil, so again, greater than 10% organic matter, we just don't see consistency with it in terms of application on corn. It's really small grains, and again, it's organic soils, and we do have a soil test, the DTPA, that we do suggest using, but mainly for organic soils. So that's one of the things, if you're looking at recommendations, you just have to be careful of what information you're getting from, and I see this a lot in our state, getting questions from growers that are reading things in popular press that are coming from other areas of the country, is making sure that the conditions are the same, because this is one that we know there are problems, it just isn't as widespread in the state itself. So really, I think that's really the big key is first is deciding, is it going to be an issue for the crop you're growing? And then really the second point then is then looking at what indicators or what options that we have in terms of assessing where a problem is going to be occurring. And it's one of the things I've really been stressing to a lot of our growers is to watch what data you're taking from plant tissue tests, because they haven't really, to me, been a good indicator of where a deficiency may occur. I'm not saying not to take tissue test, but really following some guidelines in terms of making good comparative samples within fields, I think are a really good option to really see a range in growth across your fields to get a good indication of a good and a bad and maybe kind of an intermediate area for getting a better assessment in terms of what's happening is really kind of what you want to do instead of just taking a simple or just a single sample from a field to trying to identify a problem itself. Boron has been the tricky one for us, and this is the one that I've been getting more and more questions over the last 4 or 5 years. We do know that we do have problems with it, particularly with alfalfa productions. Historically for us, in our central part of the state where we've had very sandy soils, greater than 90% sand with low organic matter, when some of those soils get dry, we know we have issues that boron can become deficient in those situations. But we've been seeing a lot of reports recently of tissue analysis coming back low in boron, or what people perceive as low in boron. If we have a high soil pH, it can be an issue, but I mean, really, organic matter has really been the big thing. And I'll show some of the data that we've collected with that organic matter versus boron availability. It seems to tie in very well itself. So one of the things I did this has been a few years ago, we had 3-year study on-farm strip trials within grower fields. They were 18 locations, 9 irrigated on sandy soils, and then 9 non-irrigated on a wide range in soil types across the state. Just simple trials, yes or no, looking at a single rate of boron versus nothing, just to get an idea of what's going on. So what I'm going to show, I've got a few different graphs here. This is just looking at the, when we took the upper leaf sample from corn at V10. This is the concentration of boron in that leaf tissue versus the yield potential or deviation from maximum yield. And then on the right, what we have here is the increase in leaf boron concentration relative to the soil test itself. So showing that if we start looking at where we get the greatest increase tends to be where we have the lowest soil test. So there seems to be some tie-in between the soil test versus tissue. But if we look at yield, I mean, we see that there are some low yield points here when we get about 5 part per million or 5 milligrams per kilogram of boron. Above that, though, it tends to be much of a cloud and kind of what we'd expect to see with a non-responsive data set. So really nothing giving us a good, clear picture on what we would see in terms of a sufficient level. What I'm still telling a lot of our growers is, 5, maybe 7 part per million or greater, we would likely probably not see much of a yield response to boron for corn production. So this falls in line with a lot of what we've currently been using for some of our tissue concentrations for boron itself. Yield, this is just showing some of our plant tissue tests, so with and without boron, irrigated and non-irrigated. You can see we saw a pretty decent sized jump in terms of the tissue concentration with a similar rate of boron applied in our irrigated sites. Our rain-fed sites still seeing an increase in the tissue concentrations. This was roughly around 5 pounds or 6 kilos per hectare is kind of what we had. On the right is our grain yield though. And if you look at the numbers there for grain yield, very high yield, absolutely no yield response across the 9 irrigated or the 9 non-irrigated locations. So if you look at what we're seeing is the plant's taking up the boron. If you look at the yield, there's really no consistent yield response. So even when we see situations where we get low concentrations or what we perceive low in that 5 to 7 range, we're really not seeing where it's consistently showing us a greater yield potential. So talking to a few of our growers, I know some of our irrigated growers with very sandy soils are applying boron. I mean, that's kind of what I've been telling them, though. If you're going to be applying it, that's probably still a place to really stick to it. If you look at organic matter above 3-4%, you're likely probably not going to see much of an issue. You're really going to have to, I think, see situations where organic matter for us gets less than about 1% to really start seeing some problems with boron occur, particularly in corn production. This is just a scatter plot where I'm again just looking at the soil test itself to see if the soil test is any better. I've got a couple graphs here. There's an A and a B marked on the left graph, which is just showing the difference between 98% of maximum yield versus 100% of maximum yield, where we see a pretty wide range in terms of the soil test itself. We are recommending the hot water extractable. I don't know what Brookside is using for their the recommended method on there. I mean, really what I say with boron, and I don't know if there's any best test based on what we've been seeing, because really none of them have been really overly accurate in terms of predicting where a response will occur. So this is one that's been difficult in terms of trying to get a general handle in terms of what a good concentration would be itself. The thing here though on the right, if I look at soil test boron versus soil organic matter, you can see a clear relationship. We see a little more scatter in our data with our non-irrigated or the blue points. So if you're looking at some greater uncertainty at those points in terms of but still the relationship pretty much holds true. The more organic matter, I think, the less likely that you're going to see a response to boron, regardless of what the tissue test is telling you within a given field. So what did we learn out of these studies? Really the soil test boron is not either accurate or the level required to get a boron response is much lower than what we're finding in many of our locations. We were seeing situations, at least with the hot water extractable, where we're less than 0.08 ppm. In some of those, maybe seeing some response, but it was a very isolated number of our spots. I mean, it was less than 5% of our total field comparisons within fields that we were seeing those low values. So it wasn't really widespread. The tissue data, really what I'm seeing right now, between 4 and 16 part per million. The sufficient range currently, what we'd say for corn leaves, is about 4 to 15. I really don't have anything to refute that at this point. And we've seen that with higher yields. I think people are pushing higher concentrations. I'm not so sure that that's completely accurate, though, based on what we've been seeing. But again, just looking at our data, I mean, my data isn't all inclusive, so there may be some situations out there that are seeing some response. Would I suggest application at this time? No, but again, we know that there's some growers that are applying it. So, looking at concentrating on, based on what we've been seeing, low organic matter situations or situations we know that boron supply is not going to be high. Droughty soils, those are situations with high yields that you may want to look at it. There's few other things that have been looked at or been kicked out there, particularly looking at higher plant populations. We haven't really looked at some of that. So I know there's a lot of information out there. Just based on what we were seeing across the given sites we had, we just weren't seeing a significant yield response. So tissue testing right now, getting yield data to back up our concentrations has really been the big thing. That's what we've been trying to do because I've been trying to at least provide growers with more up-to-date information. Responses are not as likely, again, as we talked about. The big thing on it, what I've been seeing is the tissue concentrations do vary over time. So if you are taking samples, just make sure that the samples that you're taking are lining up with the database that you're looking at. So making sure that they're accurate, because we do know that micros can be impacted. Particularly if you start taking samples too late, we know that the concentrations start to go down. So the likelihood you're going to get lower concentrations are going to increase the more mature the crop is. So that's just one of the things just to be careful with that. And I do stress to growers just watching out just to make sure that they're getting the most accurate information if you're using some sort of database to compare to. Foliar, perennial crops, I think they'll probably work better. That's one of the things that we've done some work back here. In my mind, and I'll talk about this with zinc, that I'd rather be proactive if I'm looking at making corrective measures. If I do see a lot of my tissue concentrations are coming back, or a grower talking about their tissue concentrations consistently coming back low, I mean, really, to me, it makes sense trying to make your decisions up front. And that's one of the things that I've really been stressing to a lot of our growers, that if you're consistently doing a foliar application, why not, if you have some other option earlier in the growing season, just do that, or even before planting, because we know the majority of these micros are going to need to be taken up through the roots for many of the crops, particularly the annual crops that we're dealing with. So that's one of the, I think the main considerations is with timing is if it's something that you're doing consistently, see if there's another option so you don't have to continually going back out into the field for applications. Soil tests themselves, this is just showing our recommended, just some tests that we have out there we're looking at, seeing really no response other than to potentially manganese. And that's one of the things that we have looked at. We get less than 20 part per million with the DTPA test. It's going to differ if you're using the Malic 3. That's one of the things that with micros is know what test you're using, because these tests don't always measure the same amounts of micros. But for us, we are seeing maybe some potential for the DTPA test when it's less than 20. But that really looking at all these, particularly for soybean, that we look at being the soil test being actually predictive. Zinc is one for corn that we have a better handle on. For some of the other crops, I mean, dry beans, I think we have a better handle on it. Not necessarily as much for soybean itself. I was involved in a larger project that was looking at summarizing data from across the north central region, looking at soybean micronutrient response, looking at boron, copper, manganese, and zinc, just combining data from across the region. And if you look at it, this is a publication, if you really want to get into, you should be able to find online. It just talks a little bit about the number of fields that we look at the comparison, the measured soil tests, and the number of fields we'd expect responses, and the number of them we actually got responses in. And if you look at the majority of them, really no consistent response across the region. So I think looking at these four in micronutrients, boron, copper, and zinc, those three, I would expect to see less of a response to soybean. Again, this boils down to what is that crop sensitive to a deficiency to. Manganese is one that we do know that there's pockets out there that you're going to want to watch out for. Just in this case, in terms of the tests that we had, we didn't see an overall response to itself. So one of the things I'm going to say is that I'm not going to say our concentration values that any of the land-grant universities are accurate, more accurate than any that some of the private companies use. It's just the thing that we struggle with, again, is having accurate data to show that there's going to be yield response at a given nutrient concentration level. So that's one of the things that really needs to be identified, and it needs to be more widespread. The problem is if we don't get a response to that nutrient, it's really hard to do those. So one of the things I do stress is that using an average value from a data set really isn't probably the best thing to do, because it really isn't a sufficiency value. You're just looking at what the average values are. And if we have situations where the nutrients are taken up in excess quantities, it can inflate what we deem to be a sufficiency value using an average tissue concentration across a given area. So that's one of the things that I struggle with that, is just coming up with accurate values. And for some of the nutrients I know were better than others just because we can see a crop response. So I have some yield data to back up what particularly is a low value. So the last thing I'm going to go through is source of micronutrients. This kind of mainly is a thing I do a lot of discussions with zinc, particularly with growers, because we have a lot of options out there. So there's been a lot of discussions in terms of what's the best option, because source and application method can impact profitability and crop response. One of the things that is when we start looking at particularly liquid nutrients, things that we start looking at starter fertilizer mixes, chelates I think are an important thing to consider. Chelate is a Latin word meaning claw. Really what chelates do is they increase the availability of micronutrients by preventing reactions in the soil with other anions, which form insoluble compounds. So we're really trying to stave off or increase the availability, and some of the chelates can actually be taken up by the plant. It just depends on what it is. They range from synthetic to organic acids. And when we start looking at it in terms of them, they do seem to vary significantly in terms of overall cost, just based on what the chelate source is. This is a table just showing a few of them out there. The main ones that we tend to look at are EDTA, which is kind of right here in the middle. Zinc, EDTA tend to be a very good chelation source. If you're looking at something to mix in with, say, a liquid like a ammonium polyphosphate or something, because we know that zinc and phosphate tend to form insoluble compounds, and the chelation tends to help prevent some of that. Iron, EDDHA has been one of the ones we've been looking at pretty substantially when it comes to iron, that we know that it does for us where we have a lot of issues with iron deficiency chlorosis in soybean with high lime soils, that the EDDHA source, the ortho-ortho isomer, has been really important in terms of being able to correct that. So that's one of the things, if you're picking a source, is really knowing what nutrient you're trying to supply to. Iron itself for us, I'm not going to get much into that. This is a whole other presentation I gave for ASA a few months back. Soybean, we have a lot of high lime soils that we know that we have issues with iron. And we start looking at it in terms of problems. Really isn't an issue with our soils not having iron. It's just an issue with soybean being a very poor extractor of iron, particularly in situations where we have carbonates in the soil, which tend to neutralize some of the acids that the soybean roots release to solubilize iron that's in the soil. We have looked at other crops, and corn does, since we grow corn in a lot of the areas that we grow soybeans where we have iron chlorosis. We have seen instances. This picture, hopefully it's up there. You've got to have a picture of corn on your screen right now.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so this is a situation where we went out to grower and was having trouble. This corn was striped. If you look at it, it looks almost to me like stereotypical iron deficiency symptoms, and it would be an area of the field where we'd expect to see iron problems, high pH, low area of the field. pH in this area was around 8.3 or 8.4, so a lot of carbonates in the soil. However, when we looked at it, we added iron. Then I just kind of out of a whim, I added sulfur and did with and without sulfur. And if you look at it, we had about a 15 bushel to the acre response to sulfur and no response to the iron. And this was a foliar application in 2014. In 2015, I went in back with this 3 to 6 gallons to the acre of this product Redline, which contains ortho-ortho EDDHA, which is the iron source that we use to correct for iron deficiency. No yield response, and again, sulfur was the big thing coming out of this. So it isn't as simple as we start looking at where we visually think we have one problem. This was a situation where sulfur was our main culprit for corn, at least. Soybeans still would be iron within this given area of the field. So this was kind of one of the things that kind of came up. And if we look at iron, dry beans, soybean are going to be our big two that we have iron problems with. And again, this is all boils down to situations where we have high salts or high pH out in the western part of the state. If you are selecting a chelate, though, look at chelate stability. For iron, EDDHA has been the better when we start talking about stability over a wide range in pH. So if you are looking at some of these other iron sources, if you have more acidic soils, they're probably going to work better. If you're talking about like EDTA products, for us, EDTA does not work very well for high pH. We get pHs above 7.4, 7.5. It doesn't have a very good stability, and that's where we look at products like soy green Fairlene. There's a few other ones out there that are ortho EDDHA products are our best options. For zinc, we have good stability of DTPA, EDTA, and HEDTA. So it just depends on cost. And the majority of our 9% zinc products, if you're going to go out and buy a liquid product, is going to be fully chelated with EDTA. But watch, because some of the products, and I'll show you some data from a 10% product that we were testing, that is partially chelated. So it's partially EDTA and it's partially citric acid, which isn't as good of a chelation source with it. And we weren't really seeing as good a performance with that particular product. Zinc, if we start looking at where we have problems, this is the primary one. We know that we have soils that are just low in zinc. When I say low, we use a DTPA zinc test. If we get less than 0.5 part per million, we consider that low. If you're using a Malic 3, the numbers are going to be slightly higher for a critical range. I'd say probably 0.75 or lower. Some growers may use 1 part per million or lower for that. This is a kind of a situation where to get really widespread problems, we have to get very low zinc tests. And that upper left picture is a picture from our southeastern part of the state. This is a more acidic soil, kind of an eroded piece where they had just the zinc soil test is low. And this is kind of something that I would say is rare that I see that widespread of an issue. Normally, if we go areas where we have low zinc, I'll see a plant here or there that's showing some of the characteristic white striping, but it isn't as widespread that we see as the large patches across fields. I've looked at a number of things though. We've looked at both starter in-furrow options, so placing fertilizer with the seed, liquids with and without chelated zinc. This is just an example of that. This is 8 locations with 1034 ammonium polyphosphate with or without a quart of a 10%. This product's called Blue Tsunami, which is a 10% chelated zinc. It's a citric acid EDTA mix. Again, it's not fully chelated. Looking at the soil test values in the far right column, you can see that we range from 0.6 up to about 2.8. And there's only one location, that Lamberton one at the bottom, which I would say that we have a chance for a yield response. If you look at across these locations, maybe only one out of the mix that there was a yield response. And it was kind of an odd response. It's this Wasika 2012, which tested 1.4. Consistently, again, we get above 1. I just do not see a response. So looking at a widespread use of this situation where we have growers that are using a lot of liquid starters with the corn seed with chelated zinc, that we don't always see that it's going to pay out across every single field. And we've seen that consistently with some of these products. I have looked at some of the newer sources. We've been looking at since about 2015, doing some testing with some of the micro essential products from Mosaic. This is looking at just the yield response to zinc. Looking at averaging with this is a 2-pound rate of zinc per acre as micro essentials or as zinc sulfate. I averaged them together because there was no difference in these particular soils. If you want to know kind of where our soil tests are, just at the bottom of these graphs, they range from 0.49 all the way up to 0.77. These are all acidic soils. So we look at pHs of 6 or less in many of these sites. So I wouldn't suspect to see any issues. One of the questions I get more and more with micro essentials, particularly micro essentials SZ, is the source of zinc is zinc oxide. And that solubility of that product can be an issue of just a straight zinc oxide in some of these fields. And a lot of these acidic soils, though, we've seen really no issues with it. So if you're using it, it isn't a bad product. I have some comments though related to just some concerns I have with it. Out of these 6 locations, one site, you look at 15 bushel per acre yield increase or close to 1,000 kilos per hectare yield increase for corn, so pretty sizable yield advantage. We look at that site though not being the lowest out of the bunch. So again, even though we have situations where I would expect a yield response, so we'll just look at the Lamberton 2015, that orange square, testing 0.49 ppm, that it isn't always that we're seeing a yield advantage of these sites. On the right hand, that just shows the tissue concentration, showing that indeed we're getting the zinc into the plant. So it's not that the plant's not taking the zinc up, it's just not needing it. And you know, why every once in a while we see a yield response, I don't know. That was a higher yielding year, I think this 2017 site, but we haven't seen that necessarily become an advantage. So we know there are issues out there, there are situations out there where we're going to get a response. They just haven't been as predictive as I would like. Dry broadcast applications, this is just another example, just showing kind of what we have for this is a situation where I did not see any deficiencies in the field, although we saw a small yield increase to a 2-pound rate. So again, this is similar to what the previous slide was showing. This is only looking at though just a very small yield advantage, maybe around 6-7 bushels. So they are out there. It's just identifying them is really the main issue. Is really what you get to kind of concern yourself is what's the best option in terms of it. Is it a soil test, which we recommend, or is it some other means to identify where a response will occur? So my take-home message on zinc really is our zinc and phosphate. If you are doing some sort of starter mix, just be careful. Although we know some growers have had some luck with some ammoniated zinc products that aren't chelated. It can kind of depend on whether or not you get precipitation and see some issues with sludge in the tanks if you're dealing with a liquid starter. I do recommend the soil test. The main thing though is knowing what your critical level is, because we know there's some regionality to what soil tests are being used. So make sure if you're taking data from a specific location that you know that, particularly for us, that we use a DTPA test where our critical level is going to be lower than the Malic 3, is that you have good data when it comes to good regional data to be using for assessing that. Broadcasting, that's been the main question right now. And that's been one of the things that I've kind of stressed to the growers is, are you better off with just hitting all your acres with a chelated zinc and a starter, or looking at situations where you raise or just doing a variable rate application when you need it? And that's been kind of a main question. I did mention mez. There was one other comment I wanted to make with that. And one of the only disadvantage I would see to a product like that is that you're locking yourself into a set ratio of zinc. So if you need more than 2 pounds to the acre, that you're going to have a hard time getting that without over applying phosphorus. So it's one of the things. This is a product where it gives you a small amount, and I think there's some advantages to that. Just be careful with that. If you do need a higher rate, you may need some other option. So with broadcasting, I have been looking at in terms of how much it takes to increase our soil test by 1 part per million. It does range by soil. This is just kind of at the right, showing some examples. The top 2, Becker and Lamberton, are acidic soils. So 1.7 to 3 pounds per part per million, it's really taken to get that. With Crookston and Morris, more high pH soils, we're seeing it takes more zinc to increase the soil test itself. So we can increase zinc concentration in the soil by applying more than we need, but it does vary in terms of the soil, in terms of how they react. Usually what I recommend, about a 5-pound application rate, gives us multi-years benefit. So just to wrap things up here, foliar applications, when I look at it, I do have some questions in terms of whether we're treating the symptom or we're actually treating the problem. That's one of the things that I do kind of stress to a growers is, again, if you're looking at options, if you see that consistently you're seeing some low concentration of things you need to correct, that maybe doing it up front is probably going to be the better option than trying to be too reactionary. Starter banded micros, for those that have the option, I know that isn't as widespread in some areas of the US or across the world. For us, since we have issues with low phosphorus soils, we tend to see more of instances of in-furrow applications where we're applying starter directly on the seed. That I think this is probably a better option to feed the roots than a foliar application. It just really depends on what options you have. So it's kind of one of the things I stress, just put a micros package in with a starter. If you're going with multiple foliar applications, just do it once and kind of fix it and hopefully forget about it for the rest of the season. Some of the other micros that are out there, you just have to kind of read up on them. Molybdenum, chloride, nickel. Again, these just kind of depend. Some of these are beneficial and not necessarily needed by all crops. Just kind of know what is and what isn't to make sure we're not over applying. And really, if I get back to, are the odds in your favor? Looking at micros, that again, we see that even with the higher yields right now, is that application of micros across all fields and all situations don't necessarily increase our odds for increased yields, or increased, and that higher yields don't always mean that we need a higher concentration of micronutrients themselves. It's really just getting a general handle regionally, and really what works and what doesn't work is really what's important to do. Tissue tests themselves really is, it just makes sure you have accurate data, and that's the main thing. And that's why I like taking comparative samples, which I think there's some power in doing that. So I'm not saying to not take them, I'm just saying to be careful in terms of the overall assessments, because again, making sure we have yield data behind them is very important moving forward. And then soil tests itself, again, regionally, know what soil tests are, know what the critical levels are, because again, I can't take my same recommendations for growers I have here in Minnesota and take them farther out to the east or to any other parts of the world, because they are going to be regional specific and specific to the soil test itself. So while it is the best option, I think for some of our micros, just be careful in terms of what the data you're getting. So again, it's something that we're continually working on. I've got a lot of product testing work going in. It's something that we'll continue to work on, and zinc has kind of been the main target. So that's one of the things that with corn production, I think it's one of the things to watch out more than anything. If you're doing soil tests, it's one of the ones that I do suggest that most growers pay attention to. And then it's just looking at just some of the other nutrients. If you think they're going to be deficient, just soil test again. Just start with it. Just see where things are at. If you're using plant tissue tests, you have the two to compare to. It's really the best thing you can do. So with that, that's all I have. Unless we can take some questions here at this point if we have some time.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I think I appreciate you taking the time to do this. We've got at least 10 or 15 minutes here, so if anybody wants to have a few questions before we hit the hour, but if no one has anything, that's totally fine too. I've got a comment or two, but does anybody want to chime in here? Feel free. I think that was the 11-second pause that I've been told to kind of do for letting that happen. So no, I do have one question here, Dan. Actually, I have two questions. Earlier, when you were talking about the boron in corn, you showed that in your research that there was nothing in the grain. I mean, it was really no significant differences, no change across the actual grain, and the yields is the same, but the concentration in the stover or in the plant tissue itself went way up in the boron. Do you know off the top of your head, did that correlate to an impact on the harvest index? Like, was there more stover produced going back into the soil for recycling later, or was it just basically the same stover, just slightly tweaked on the boron?
So that's a good question. That's one of the things that we did not measure. So what we had actually there were their upper leaf samples. So we're trying to be consistent with some of what the growers were taking for some of the assessments. So I
Okay.
don't know whether they were bigger or not. Normally we haven't seen that if we look at some of our other crops and our other fields we've tested in that, but I really can't say, because really all that study was looking at was the yield, and then we're trying to assess the soil test and the tissue with the upper leaf samples to see. So, I mean, it could have, I don't know on that. Normally what we see is if we don't really see any sizable increases in yield, that really yield and stover production are pretty well tied together. Other than outside of we start seeing starter effects, but a lot of times some of the starter effects, the plants tend to catch up. We don't see too much of a difference between it. So I can't really say on that if that changed the harvest index at all with it, because that's one of the things that we just didn't have the ability to measure.
Yeah, so Leron just typed into the chat window that he'd like to unmute and ask a question. So feel free, Leron, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So I was actually on a webinar recently. This was put on by the Understanding Ag folks, and they had done some testing in vacuum, I guess is how I would describe it, where they put CO2 into the vacuum and they measured the difference between basically exactly what you were talking about, is that the tissue accepted the nutrition, but there was no increase in yield. But when they manipulated the level of CO2, then the yield changed. And so what they were saying was there was some type of, and I may be getting the detail wrong here, but there was some type of oxidation taking in the alternate scenario, such that the plant was still taking it up, but it wasn't able to utilize it because it was still not in the correct format. Can you speak to that? Maybe I didn't make enough sense, but if not, I can try to add. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I haven't looked at any of that data on it. What we see a lot of times is, and this does happen for us with iron, with some of our iron chlorosis situations where the plant will take it up, but it can't convert it from iron 3 to iron 2, so it'll just collect. With boron, since boron is it's taken up in the negative, the anion form, it's going to flow in with water. So I'm not so sure. I mean, I said I can't really speak to any of the CO2, what they're talking about with that. We see a lot of the nutrients, the plant just will take it up, but it just, yeah, it won't effectively utilize it. With situations like boron, with being negative, it's going to flow. If it flows in with water, it's really not as controlled as it will be with some of the other elements. So that's one of the reasons why that one is risky. Is just because if the plant doesn't really regulate in terms of what it's taken up, it can drive it to toxicity problems very quickly. And it's one of the interesting things with that one is I had some pictures. It's been probably 6-7 years ago of some dry bean fields where they had foliar applied. You could see right down to the line where we had toxicity problems occurring with that, where the plant was it just had too much going into the plant, and the plant really wasn't doing anything with it. So, like I said, I haven't really seen any of that. I'd have to look at that data to see, just to kind of see what's happening. We know that there's many of the nutrients, so the plant's going to take up excess quantities, or it's going to take it up if it's going to be there, and if it doesn't have the ability to utilize it, it's just going to sit in there, so the concentrations are going to go higher. So zinc is one of them we see consistently, even though that's a anion that's being positive, it's a cation, I mean, being taken up, that it'll accumulate in there. So we'll see essentially with higher concentrations with higher application rates, and yeah, boron is definitely the one with that. But no, I guess I'd have to look at that just to kind of see, because I'm not aware of that.
Okay, thank you. And Leron posted in the chat window here if anybody hadn't seen it, but the webinar that he was referencing is available at the Understanding Ag website. So if you wanted to check that out, that's Ray Archuleta and Gabe Brown's group. They're working with there. And does anyone else have any other comments or questions? I've got one more, but I can concede that to somebody else if they'd like. All right, I guess my question here, now, and I know that this wasn't necessarily the topic of the talk, but I know recently at the San Antonio ASA meeting, I sat in on a lot of talks on biological amendments and biological products and things like that. I know that's a lot of interest in that. I was wondering if you've had any experience with some of those products that might be, a lot of them will have boron, manganese, zinc, and copper kind of mixed in with them. So sometimes, are we getting an impact or an effect from it from a micronutrient, or is it the microbial strains? I was just wondering if you had any experience running any trials with some biological products that may have some micros kind of mixed in, and how you kind of tease out what those differences might be. I don't know if you've gone down that road at all.
Well, we've been working on a few things. This last year, we actually were working with Pivot Bio on one of their products. I had a couple sites that was mainly looking at nitrogen. So looking at some free living end fixers. So if you look at biologicals, there's a few different ways things can go. I think some of the products, if you look at organic acids can have chelation properties. Some of those were listed on that table. I didn't go through them all. So they can have some impact on increasing the availability of micronutrients. We haven't seen anything consistently. I had the only positive benefit I've had, product called Accomplish LM we tested. That's been a number of years ago. I had probably 10 locations. At one of the sites, we saw an increase in yield. I was never able to really attribute what that was to, whether it was micros, whether it was something else, increasing some of the biological activity. So that's kind of an unknown, really, for me, because the testing we've done, I've tried to do the best I can in terms of trying to pin down to see what exactly they're doing. Because the thing about it, if you start mixing in a micros package with some of these, you could just be getting a straight response to the micros and maybe not the biological activity. So there's a lot of things there that just really we don't know at this point. A lot of the work right now we're looking at though mainly is on the nitrogen side. So I haven't really looked too much in the metals side, because the majority of what we have in terms of issues, it's really mainly boils down to zinc. So that one, it's a pretty easy fix if you're looking at a broadcast application. Some of the microbial stuff, if it does have an impact, we've just never been able to track it. So that's where I'd kind of look at it, I guess, some of that stuff, particularly if anything that's got a chelation properties, probably where going to be the main benefit's going to be. If you can have something that's going to be able to chelate and increase the availability of some of the micros over the growing season, that's really what you're going to be looking at, particularly for micronutrients being of probably the bigger benefit.
Oh, thank you. Well, with that, I think if no one else has any further questions, I have a couple just wrap up announcements for future webinars. So I guess one last opportunity. Anybody got a question, feel free to type it in the chat window or unmute yourself. All right, well, I guess that wraps it up for the day. So it's a beautiful Friday. At least you said you had some ice up your way, Dan. I think it worked out pretty well. I appreciate you working through some of the internet lag issues. I think it went pretty smooth, so we appreciate you taking the time to do this today. Also, everybody else on the call, thanks for coming in and joining us. I've been making there's a newsletter coming out later today. I was hoping it'd be out yesterday, but it's going to come out today from Amplify. We've been advertising next week, next Thursday. We were going to have a webinar with Patrick Johnson on personal finances. Unfortunately, that one's been canceled. So if you were planning on joining us next Thursday, that is off the table. We're going to reschedule that for the fall. So next Friday will be Good Friday. So please spend that with your family. There will be no webinars. But then the following Friday on April 17th, Missy Bauer of B&M Crop Consulting is going to be joining us for her second installment of a corn planter webinar, sort of a mini corn planter clinic that she's been doing. So you can check out the first video on the YouTube portal or on the members portal. That was more of a in the barn, in the shop field setup before you get going. And 2 Fridays from now, she'll be talking about in-field adjustments and things you can tweak once you've actually got into the field and started bumping around a little bit to tweak the planter to get better seed soil contact and depth and everything right. The following Friday after that, on April 24th, Mitchell Hora from Continuum Ag is going to be discussing the SO19 soil health tool and how he's using it in his consulting business. And then actually just scheduled today on Friday, May 22nd, 10 a.m. same time, we're going to have Dr. Micah Woods from the Asian Turfgrass Center give a discussion on his approach to the minimum level of sustainable nutrition, so a slightly different approach to fertilizer recommendations for turfgrass management. That'll be a good one in May 22nd. That's all we've got on the docket right now, but we're actively reaching out to people and lining up some more through June and July. So with that, everybody have a great weekend. Please stay safe, enjoy your family, stay at home, play some games, and with that, thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good day.